Welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast by Third Wave. Today, I'm speaking with Jonathan Lu and Shauheen Etminan, the co-founders of VCENNA.
The thing that really interests us the most, if we look at really the history of plant medicine, almost never was it just this one drug or one target, one compound approach. That's kind of this simplistic approach that it would be great if medicine and the human body worked that way. I can cure you just by affecting this one thing. All of a historical medicine and plant use has always been mixtures of trying to figure out, without understanding really the first principle science, what combinations can most impact. And we now have the ability to use some of that first principle science to better understand, if not have a full knowledge, which we may never have, about why these things work.
Hey listeners, I am so excited to have both Jonathan Lu and Shauheen Etminan on the podcast today. We talk about their supplement, Magi. Magi comes from the Persian word that represents the ancient magicians of old. And what Jonathan and Shauheen have created is an incredible legal supplement that is based in Syrian Rue, an ancient medicine from the Middle East. We first met a couple of years ago at a conference in Miami. About a year after that, I tried their supplement for the first time. It's called Stard, S-T-A-R-D, and had an opportunity to see how it combined with a microdose of LSD to allow for that state of no mind. I talk about this in the podcast. And what's great about this Syrian Rue supplement is that it's completely legal. So you can purchase it today, and you'll notice the meditative quality that comes from it. It's really impressive. Just a little bit of background about Jonathan and Shauheen. Jonathan is the co-founder of VCENNA, a drug discovery company that creates mental wellness solutions from psychoactive plants used ceremonially in ancestral Eastern traditions. Jonathan is an engineer, and he's been studying 2,000-year-old Chinese texts in search of compounds, formulations, and rituals that have been lost to history. Shauheen is an intuitive activator and repeat founder with a passion for creating impactful products and platforms that embody wellness, abundance, authenticity, reciprocity, and inclusion. He has a track record of working in multiple industries, amongst which psychedelics for mental wellness and cognitive growth is aligned with most because of his life story as a founder and his mission as an autotelic entrepreneur. Shauheen holds both an MSc and Ph.D. in chemical engineering from the University of Calgary, and he is a secular mystic who practices Sufi, dervishes, whirling meditations. All right, that's it for now. Let's go ahead and dive into this episode with Jonathan and Shauheen. I hope you enjoyed this riveting conversation about Syrian Rue. Hey listeners, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we have Shauheen Etminan and Jonathan Lu who are joining us. They are co-founders of Magi, which is a really interesting company that we'll talk more about today. And Shauheen and Jonathan and we all met at the Wonderland conference, not in 2022, but in 2021. And then I saw them again at the Wonderland conference in 2022. And I was like, wait, didn't we have some really interesting conversations last year? And so we ended up hanging out for the entire conference, more or less, including a whirling dervish experience from Shauheen at 4 a.m. after our after hours Wonderland party. So we had a ton of fun. They've come out with a new product line called Stard, or a new product called Stard, amongst a product line that's focused on beta-carbolines, which we'll get into in this episode. It's going to be really fascinating because we're both going to touch on the sort of historical context, even an anthropological context around beta-carbolines, around Syrian Rue, around haoma, which you'll learn about in this episode. And we're also going to talk about the sort of neurochemical, the biological, what's actually happening in the brain and the body when we take these beta-carbolines with or without psychedelics. So Shauheen, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Paul.
It's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
So,
and mutual friends in common.
And mutual friends in common who happen to be listening into this in the background. We won't mention any names, Idausa, but it's good to have you kind of with us. So the first, whenever I have a couple people on the podcast who are here together, what I love to lead in for the audience is, how do you know each other? What's the sort of origin story of your relationship? How did you meet? And how is that relevant to Magi, the company that you've co-founded together?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, John and I know each other from a Singularity University in Silicon Valley. Yeah, at the time, back in 2018, I was working on a very different tech-related startup, and John was our cohort, basically one of the experts for the cohort, and coaches. So yeah, we kind of we connected at that point, but mostly around psychedelics and neurohacking, basically biohacking, and that relation is, we kept the relation until back in 2021 again. That at that time I was already working on basically VCENNA, which is our main company, our drug discovery company. And I reached out to John. I was very lucky that John was in between, ventures, and yeah, he just joined, and we have been working since.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, that naturally appealed to me from Shauheen is that, as opposed to myself that only studied the topic but never really worked, and maybe I can borderline say that I consider myself a chemical engineer. He was a real chemical engineer, studied a Ph.D. and was one of the world's foremost leading experts when it comes to mass transfer, which is particularly important when it comes to the products that we are working on here, which are all derived from how do you take these compounds out of the plant.
So Singularity University, Shauheen, you were working on a startup. Jonathan, you were helping to advise and coach within that cohort. You come together, and in 2021, you start Magi. What is the overarching goal or vision or mission of Magi?
Yeah, the story of Magi is a little bit longer than that, but we started VCENNA as our drug discovery company, which the Magi is our supplement product that came to market kind of later back in last year. But like many other companies that they just dived into the psychedelic space, and at the beginning it was very hot around drug discovery and medicalization. We kind of like spent about a year and went through all the steps around drug discovery, toward a clinical trial, which kind of built our basis around pharmacology, neuroscience, data science, and informatics, and kind of everything that you need for a drug discovery, except the fact that we were working on natural compounds and we were working on holistic wellness. So these two parameters were what was not very easy to move it forward from the capital, basically raising capital and financing the company, because natural products are not patentable. And then the other thing is that, like, when it comes to holistic wellness, usually FDA likes like simpler single molecule drugs to be pushed toward like clinical trials, when we were working on multiple receptors, and kind of, we call it polypharmacology. That's always come, as more risky for the investors. So it was kind of like around summer 2022 that we decided that, like, we kind of like halted our drug discovery for becoming basically a pharmaceutical drug, and then we brought our like year and a half or 2 years of work toward launching this supplement called Magi. And maybe I'll leave it to John to tell a little bit about Magi's focus.
So where we are with Magi was the same origin, the same objective for where we began with VCENNA, which was, as we looked across the industry and we saw a number of players starting to get into the market, really there was not a lot of diversity among the different compounds that we're working on. Almost everything at the time was focused on some variants of LSD, psilocybin, or MDMA. And from our own just ancestral history, there's this wide array and this very rich legacy of plant medicine using a number of plants, some very esoteric and forgotten, some that are fairly well known but forgotten what their use was, where we saw this opportunity for us to bring not just natural plant medicine, but natural plant medicine using some of the unknown or forgotten plants and compounds that had been lost to time from particularly Eastern Asian plant medicine. And that's where the foundation of our drug discovery program came from. And then the foundation for all our scientific knowledge is we pursued that drug discovery program and realized that there were a couple compounds that, if we put them in isolation, are unscheduled and we can bring to market much sooner as a supplement that brings some value to the customer, rather than going through a 7-year FDA clinical process to go prove if these are safe and effective for a very narrow window of medical definition.
And what are those compounds?
Those compounds are the ones that we have within our products that are, at first, our first line is based on a class of beta-carbolines, as you mentioned before, particularly those harmala alkaloids that are most commonly known as being the ingredients used from ayahuasca together with DMT, but actually are richer in concentration from the plant that we're using, which is this ancestral Iranian plant called Espand.
Tell us a little bit more about Espand and the sort of anthropological context in Zoroastrian or Persian history.
Yeah, this is getting back to around kind of the old religions in Iran. Kind of the timing is around like 1500 to around 2000 years before Christ, and that's the time that there were the shamanic practices within the Iranian religion that the compound or basically it's been mostly a mixture called haoma has been used by just the caste of priests, not by general people. Like unlike ayahuasca, this is just was very limited to to the priests and also like some of the kings, and they were taking these psychoactive compounds for having access to the realm of unconscious or after death. And the main reason for that was to basically check on the truth of their religion and the rituals that they were just participating in. And then when you look into the history, that has been brought into Zoroastrian and pantheon as well. So haoma, if you look into Avesta or Gotha, has been reported that was being used as a very potent intoxicant. And it also comes from Sanskrit, and soma, which comes mostly from India. That some they're relating these two to be the same. Like the name is going to be the same, and the meaning means to press out. So the process was pressing out something from basically the active compounds from the main plant or any type of botanical identity that it had. And but the interesting work has been around like about 45 years ago. There was a very big topic around what was the kind of like the botanical identity of this intoxicant, haoma or soma, and that was around the time that like Gordon Wasson also like published his book around soma, and then he kind of claimed that soma was fly agaric or mushrooms, which is like kind of like he defines it as Amanita muscaria. But then later on around that time, like Terence McKenna also talks about, like what was haoma. He thinks mostly again like that around psilocybin as the main identity of this intoxicant. But again, at the same time, there has been another ethnopharmacologist. His name is David Flattery, who is the author of the book Haoma and Harmaline. And then they have a whole book on this topic, which is a collaboration between him, who traveled it through Iran from 1960 to around 1963, and a linguist, a Gothic linguist, which was basically the main book of Zoroastrian, to kind of unlock what was the subjective experience of taking haoma and then bringing that into some type of kind of deciphering from that subjective experience. So I think the main distinction that they brought on was that soma was very related to the flora of India versus haoma, and then they focus fully on haoma and Iran because most of the verbal poems and poetries that was left from that time kind of like was transcribed in about like 1,000 years later, and they think that like everything that exists in Gotha or in Avesta is more accurate around haoma, and if you study haoma, at least you can get to more accurate chemistry. And and then basically they concluded that because of the subjective effect, that was Peganum harmala, Espand, or Syrian Rue, which is a very high potent source of beta-carbolines. It's very interesting. It's exactly like Banistrios's copy wine, which comes from the bark of this twisted tree from Amazon. That is also a very high kind of like container of alkaloids of harmala, but they are called them Banistrine in kind of like in Iran they call it harmala on harmaline. And it's kind of like in general, it has about 5 times more alkaloid content than Banistriopsis copy.
And also, very importantly, it's not endangered.
Yeah, and then the whole context goes around like how was haoma being used, which is the story is that like haoma was being used a lot, by the priest and as well as the warriors for very different reasons. And even though like it's like a potion or it's like an elixir, it seems that like based on my study, it seems that like they were using it in different contexts. They were using it with different pharmacology. And then another distinction that comes in is that Zoroastrians are not relating themselves to any use of chemicals, for their religion today, and that's why it's been lost, because they believe that one of the reforms that Zarathustra brought into Zoroastrianism as become a philosophy and religion later on was that he asked them to stay away from overusing this compound. And then again, let's say it continued to come into the time for Achaemenid time. Like there are reports that they were using it. This is kind of a little bit before the Jesus Christ time, and then after that it's the Sassanid time that the Zoroastrianism becomes kind of like a state religion in the Iranian plateau, and there are reports and there are kind of like all kinds of transcriptions around use of this again by the priest. And this goes all the way to when Iran is occupied by Islam, and after that time it's kind of like this is getting fully lost for multiple reasons. So this is but there are multiple referrals from these texts from all the way from Gatha, which is the direct poems of Zarathustra, and then later on Avesta, which was added to main Gatha, about the stories and referrals to getting intoxication for traveling to the realm of divine and then accessing to the unconscious.
So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about the subjective effects of Syrian Rue, of harmala, of haoma. Kind of bring us deeper into like if working with this, and Shauheen mentioned touching it a little bit, but if working with this, let's say listeners are curious about this, and we'll get a little bit more into STARD and what that entails. But just what are the subjective effects of this? And just to clarify for the listeners, when we say that when we talk about haoma as an MAOI, it means that it does need to be combined with some sort of tryptamine in order to have a classic psychedelic effect. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what does just taking the MOAI do and what happens when we combine that with a tryptamine compound. What impact, what effect does that have?
Yeah, I love that question because that's always been the classic belief that Yage or Banisteriopsis caapi, the source of the harmful alkaloids, that's only there to potentiate the DMT, and they don't have an impact by themselves, which even in the Amazonian tribes, there are a number of them, I think particularly more in Colombia, that they actually didn't use chacruna. They actually only used Yage within their ayahuasca brew. But to answer your question, what is the effect there? I think like the best way that I can describe it is what was the original name of banisterine before it was actually discovered to be the same compound as harmine and harmaline. It was actually called telepathine, and it was called that for a natural reason. Is that from these high doses, the subjective experience from a lot of the indigenous shamanic use was around what they would call kind of telepathy, but more, I think we would distill that to be more of a visions that you would see when you're in this dreamlike state that don't necessarily originate from your own past. So we often think about the therapeutic values of dreaming, or a lot of the therapeutic values of going on a psychedelic journey from being able to re-experience our own common experiences. But the subjective experience that we find from dosages with a level of harmine, harmaline, or any of these harmful alkaloids is that you actually start to begin to see some of these visions that you don't know where they originate from. And oftentimes there are some common motifs. And what I love about what Shauheen just said here is we oftentimes think about the shaman. If you were, I love as an instructor of language here would appreciate a good way to understand the context behind what a word means is you Google it. And you Google the word shaman, what are the top 100 hits? It's always going to be an Amazonian kind of medicine man type look. Whereas the origin of the term shaman actually comes from Siberia, of an Asian use. And we don't often think about the shaman as being, the wise old Taoist monk that's up in a hermit living in the cave with a long goatee, or the Zoroastrian priest meditating in front of a fire. But these were very much a shamanic use, and all with a very common intent of trying to elevate our own consciousness, elevate our own level of achieving transcendence, largely through experiencing in a dreamlike state what is it like to die, and what is the other world that's waiting for us so that we don't have to have this fear of our life and we can live our lives to our fullest.
So let's focus on the word magi, since we're getting to etymology now. Magi, these were these ancient Zoroastrian priests, right? They were called magi. We know that Jesus, in sort of the biblical story, was visited by magi, and that the word magic comes from magi. So I'd love either of you to talk a little bit about that relationship from an etymological perspective between magi, the word magic, and the use of Syrian Rue or haoma. Is there some sort of anthropological connection there? Any sort of thoughts, perspectives on the overlap of magi, magic, and Syrian Rue, these Beta-Carbolines, would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love Shauheen to answer the majority of that there. The only thing I just want to preface with is, as you brought up Jesus, of course, the gift of the Magi, what that word is most well known from. These three guys from, I think it was Arabia, Iran, and India, Melchior, Balthazar, and Gaspar. What were they bringing to the birth of the Lord, the Savior? Well, two of them were psychedelic plants, frankincense and myrrh. And I can't tell you how much I wish that one of them also was Espand. But I'll leave it at that and let Shauheen go into a little more of the history of who were the Magi and how they're so important from the development of the Fertile Crescent.
And Shauheen, before you get into that, just a quick note. We had an interview years ago now with a guy named Danny Nemu, where we went deep into drugs in the Bible. So if listeners are sort of like, oh, that's super interesting, just search Danny Nemu, Nemu, and we went deep into frankincense and myrrh and other drugs in the Bible. So Jonathan, thanks for that mention.
So magi, the word, the etymology of the word, if you get to Persian word, or I guess at that time this is an Avestan word, it comes from the word magi or magus, which is basically it's the plural of magus, which in today's Farsi it's called mo. So if you look into some of the poems or poetries that are coming from Rumi and Hafiz, like there's a lot talking about like basically this group of wise people, wise men and women that they were referred to as Mogan in Farsi, which is like again the plural of magus, which is magi. And the reason that Greek called the Zoroastrian priest magi and the word magic came from, because they had this wisdom of let's say prediction, the way that they came to predict the nativity of Jesus to Bethlehem, was about the same prediction that they have from the stars. And somehow, if you look into some of the old texts, they were thinking that Magi were kind of like these sorcerers that they knew how to get the knowledge from numbers, from astrology and all of those. And that's where the word Magi comes. It means kind of like the Zoroastrian priest of ancient Iran, or even like before Zoroaster. So basically the Magi, if you look into Avesta, are the believers, the first believers who helped Zoroaster to bring his revelation to become, a kind of like a widely accepted philosophy, and later on become a religion. And back to Homa, so if you look into some of these texts, the quality of the state that they experience this kind of like outwardly journey is all coming into a dreamlike state, which this dreamlike state is what you also get under the effect of beta-carbolines. So that is one of another the reasons that we think that this among different hypothesis of what homa's main compound was, beta-carbolines are have a very high probability. And again, like looking back into, let's say, ayahuasca, what this combination of these two compounds do is that most under tryptamines, you get this interconnectedness of different part of your thoughts and brains and high flush of thoughts that allows you to think and get open and have breakthroughs, epiphanies coming up. But the part that you really getting to embark on something that you have no idea about, it's more like the dream that when you fall asleep, the dream that comes from the unknown. So that is the part that in ayahuasca also comes from the harmine, tetrahydroharmine, and harmaline, and those compounds. So we can say that in ayahuasca, they're like these two are kind of supporting each other for a very immense psychoactive journey, versus when back in Iran, like the main compound could have been only the beta-carbolines. And sometime now if you look into what, for example, is left from that today, they may have also mixed it with ephedra, which is again like a very high source of amphetamine, that potentiates in another way, potentiates homa. There are also like mang, which is the name of one of our other compounds for lucid dreaming, which mang was a combination of these compounds and tropane alkaloids, which those are kind of like very dissociative. And just to imagine like how strong of a potion that could have been. But back again to this effect of beta-carbolines, this is like the whole thing is all around this dreamlike state. So it's kind of like you're dreaming when you're awake, and that is where your conscious mind and like kind of like unconscious mind come together. And as John said, the whole point around like images that you have no idea, like flash of images that you have no idea, or the download of information immediately that are referred to as kind of like crossing through the planes of consciousness. You immediately get to know something, which is very similar to the story of revelation of Zarathustra and the other effect that works around the phenomenology of Homa in the ancient texts.
Yeah, and I'll say also very similar to the lost also elixir of Kikion from Aloysius in Greece. They're why we think we do now understand what was in Homa originally. There is something that's kind of beautiful around the mystery of not knowing what was in this magic potion. But certainly these were all used from the same intent across numerous religions, across numerous different epochs of time.
Yeah, where does consciousness emerge from? How can we utilize these different potions? And of course, in today, 2023, potions are not necessarily what we're looking for. We're looking for FDA approval of single molecules, which is why you shifted from, I think, VCENNA and drug development into more focusing on sort of non-scheduled substances that can be brought about. I'd love for you to sort of root this just in something a little bit more practical for the audience that's listening around, let's say they're interested in working with this molecule, right? They're interested in working with this plant, the beta-carbolines, the haoma, the Syrian Rue, starred, whatever we want to call it. What are some protocols to be aware of, to understand how might it be combined with, let's say, a microdose of LSD or a microdose of psilocybin, or even a full dose, right? We know of Ayahuasca is something that has become more and more of a thing. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the modern use of this. How do you intend for it to be utilized? And when we, for example, take it with a microdose of psilocybin or a microdose of LSD, how does the MAOI or the beta-carboline potentiate the tryptamine or the lysergamide?
Yeah, for that last question there, I would certainly love to hear from a little bit from your own experience, but we can table that for a little bit. For the classic use is if we look around the ceremonial shamanic use of deeper insight in more of something like a psychedelic journey. I mean, there it is combine it together with the tryptamine, particularly something that that is activating something that's more like what Shauheen describes as this kind of flush of thoughts together with a more dreamlike element. The MAOI impact to help prevent its own breakdown, that certainly is one of the benefits of it. But when you look at the different receptors that these beta-carbolines hit themselves, they are very unique. And particularly, there's one that's known as the imidazoline receptor that has been very understudied that we believe is really the key towards consciousness. It's one that's highly implicated as an analgesic towards pain sensation and towards the perception that we have. So that's where we get some of the impact of just taking it by itself, and then certainly amplified when combined together with a tryptamine in a fairly high dose. Now, as a micro dose, or even as what we might call like a mini dose, where it is perceptive, certainly not psychedelic. This is where we formulated our products towards. There are some very specific use cases where we have designed them towards. And Start, as you'd mentioned, our marquee product is really the most unique one that's out there, where there's really nothing else that's like it in terms of what we would use it for. And that use case is inspired by the original shamanic use of the Magi, which was meditation. I love that even Roland Griffiths talked about how meditation, he said something like meditation is the gateway drug towards psychedelics. This is really just the most basic way we have of understanding ourselves.
And I find that it kind of on that Roland Griffiths quote, I think it's the opposite. Psychedelics are the gateway drug into meditation. In other words, a lot of people who work with psychedelics, especially at an early age, right, when they have this experience, and I am one of these people, when we have these experiences, we go, how do we stabilize at that level of quote unquote enlightenment? And we come to realize that meditation is the most consistent practice that we can integrate that helps to do that. There's a guy named Mike Crowley, who you might know, who I still got to get on the podcast at some point, who wrote a book called The Secret Drugs of Buddhism, around how these thought leaders now on sort of Buddhism and meditation that we know, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach, there's many others that have become quite prominent, that many of them started their path with psychedelics in the 60s. They had these awakening, enlightening experiences, and they found that the Buddhist philosophy, the meditative philosophy, was the best way to sort of elongate or stabilize at these same levels of enlightenment. And I think the product that you've created will focus on Starred in particular, which I want to hear you talk a little bit more about the details of Starred in terms of what's the sort of formulation, what are the ingredients, how much do we take, blah, 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 blah. But my experience with Starred, I did it on two separate occasions. I took 2 pills with a microdose of LSD. What I found is that it was quite harsh on the gastrointestinal system. I remember I texted Shauheen, this was about 2 months ago now, when I was having the experience, and I was like, do you purge a lot on this? Because I couldn't leave my home for the first 3-4 hours of the experience because I kept having to use the toilet, TMI. But it just kept flushing out more and more and more and more. And I thought it was because I had eaten grocery store sushi the night before. But turns out it was actually the MAOI, the Starred, that was having an impact on my system. Now, what I found is after that initial, let's say 3-4 hours, when I was in the clear, I went to the beach. I did a deep meditative walk, and then I did a sun gazing meditation as the sun set. And I found that the state of mind that I was able to open up with Starred in combination with a microdose of LSD just allowed for, there's a lot of spaciousness, but it's like I could focus all of that openness on a single thing. So normally when we're focused, we're on a single thing. We can't quite have as much of a spacious purview. And when we're too spacious, we're too purview, we can't necessarily dive in. And what I found is when microdosing was started, it allowed me to both be incredibly expansive and to have a level of focus that I could really open up ideas and then go into them and explore them in a way that felt methodical and rational. So I had those. So I did it with 2 with a microdose of LSD. I did 10 micrograms of LSD. And then I did it with a microdose of psilocybin and 1. And I found 1 to be a better balance because there were no gastrointestinal issues with one of the Starreds. And that combined with psilocybin, it wasn't quite as potentiated. So I didn't go as deep into a meditative state, but it still allowed for that expansiveness and the sort of no mind state that Buddhists often describe. And so what I found, when just microdosing LSD or when just microdosing psilocybin, there can be sometimes a tendency to feel a little too stimulated or feel a little too emotional. And what I found the MAOI, the Syrian Rue, to do is the Beta-Carbolines, is it really helped to create some balance within that, so I could again have the level of alertness that comes from this microdose, but have it be balanced with the spaciousness of the meditative MAOI, the start.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. I think you hit exactly what is the ideal experience that we were trying to do when we created Starred, which was, as opposed to many, call it, more stimulating microdoses that people would take for productivity. This is not something that you would take for, I guess, productivity in the traditional sense of how we think about, I want to go crank out 5 hours of deep work. It's something that you would take to go crank out 5 hours of deep inner work, which is really much more of that unfocus rather than that focus. In kind of meditative language, it's really ideal for something more like an open awareness meditation where you can have this understanding of the expansive nature rather than something that's more like a very strong fixed awareness meditation. And as a prelude to that there, I mean, it's probably good to talk about why do we name it Starred, and Shauheen, what does Starred mean at kind of a micro and a macro level?
Yeah, so this unfocused zone that John referred to is actually the definition of a start. A start actually is a Pahlavi word it's a very interesting word that defines a subjective experience. It's a subjective mind state, like it's an old word that means to spread out to broader consciousness, to sprawl out your mind. And under the start, this is exactly this open awareness, basically just sitting and observing without actively having your monkey mind just going around. So this is the idea behind the start, just to allow you to observe and not actively think. And that is just like, it aligns very well with the definition of the ancient kind of like subjective mind state too. But very interestingly, there are works specifically around like use of these are the work around like the imidazolin receptors on animals, on rodents, that shows this kind of like when they injected, it's just like basically just like a tracer for imidazolin receptor to rodents. The impact on the rodents was this hypnotic mind state that the animal experienced, and that kind of like relates also somehow to the effect that we see and we think that imidazolin brings into the experience. Both harmine and harmaline are have like very high affinity for imidazolin receptor, while they're mostly known as MAOI. So that is where we think that there is much more work to be done.
And it's interesting that you bring up hypnosis. I just met a hypnotist, like a world famous hypnotist, at an event this past weekend, and he had done psychedelics many years prior, but hadn't revisited them in a considerable period of time. But we were talking about what is this relationship between hypnosis and psychedelics, and how can one potentially help to benefit the other, right? Because when we're put into these states of hypnosis, which now that you bring it up, like I could see how that there would be a relationship there. These hypnotic states allow to access deep elements of our subconscious or unconscious that wouldn't normally be feasible with just a microdose, particularly. Right? When we're doing this high dose work with ayahuasca or psilocybin, as anyone here who has done a high dose knows, like there's a lot that comes to the surface from the subconscious and the unconscious. We open up that reducing valve, so to say, to have access to a lot more. And I feel like combining then Starred with a microdose allows us to access deeper levels of the subconscious or the unconscious to integrate. And so, and more so than just a plain microdose would necessarily. So Shauheen or Jonathan, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, and you were already kind of getting into this, Shauheen, but maybe flush it out a little bit more. Tell us about the relationship of, when we work with these beta-carbolines, what's going on physiologically in our body, what's going on in our brain. Do these help with neuroplasticity, like tryptamines and lysergamide? Do these help with greater sort of neuronal dendritic sprouting or connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. Tell us a little bit about what we know from a physiological or neurobiological perspective of star, beta-carbolines, haoma, all these, this sort of thing.
Yeah, physiologically here, I mean, the interesting thing when you think about most of our neurotransmitters, and even particularly some of our serotonergic neurotransmitters, I mean, of which harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, they actually do all have an affinity for 5-HT2A, 5-HT2C as well. We have more of those neuroreceptors in our gut than we do actually within our brain. And we don't just think with our brain, we think with our whole body. So some of the GI issues you brought up, I mean, those we've seen from about maybe 10-15% of people will have that reaction to harmful alkaloids. That's actually a very natural thing under most any type of a psychedelic experience, just because of just the agonism or even the activation and modulation of these different neuroreceptors. So what we do see is for what these different compounds do. I mean, in some of their historic usage, they have been used as a panacea across things as broad as actually curing gastrointestinal disorders to curing kidney disorders as an insecticide. And as we start to study a little bit more about what actually they do, there are some very distinct properties that harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, harmolol, and all the other different agents have. How we formulated our products, all of them are based on an extract of Espand, but in different dosages and ratios of those specific key alkaloids in order to give us the desired effect, and in many cases also combined with other plants or other compounds, either affect bioavailability or because there is a synergistic effect that we've got a number of new compounds that are coming out fairly soon that can give you more towards the mini, if not even kind of a macro dose immediate effect, rather than something that's a little bit more calming and grounding and unfocused like starred.
Do you want to share a little bit more about what those are? Are these the Chinese ones that you mentioned? Because we talked about what is it again? Espand?
Espand, yeah, Syrian Rue.
How do you spell that?
Is Espand.
Okay, so Espand, which would also be called Syrian Rue. Right, we're talking about the same thing here. Yep. Espand is Syrian Rue, right? Which is where we're getting this extract from. That's in star. The beta-carbolines come from Syrian Rue, the Espand. Because you had mentioned this at the beginning of the interview as well, Jonathan, that there were two. So we talked about Espand. What was that second one that maybe we didn't yet have a chance to speak about? Is it Chinese in nature? Is it Siberian in nature? What is it? Where does it come from? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we have a number of them. Many of them are also from the Iranian plateau as well. But for instance, one of the, or I should say, two plants that we've been doing a number of experiments with are, I don't exactly know what the non-Chinese names are, but Chenseng Da, and one that's called Se Zhu Cao, which is literally like a snake grass. We've characterized a little bit what the neurological impact is of these. To say that we honestly know exactly what happens when you combine them would be like saying we actually know how even Tylenol works. Just our fundamental scientific knowledge, we're getting better and better, but the just affecting one receptor doesn't just change your body. Like, so many different things are happening. So our effect is why we use some of the scientific quantification to understand what's happening within the brain and the body. There's nothing that can replace just the human experience. So as opposed to a guy like Sasha Shulgin that was going to his lab and actually mixing up these different chemicals to try himself, our approach is, well, what are the different plants that we combine in different dosages and in different ratios in order to see what those effects are? And that's how we bring our products to life.
And are these Chinese plants psychoactive, or are they just MAOIs, or what's the sort of... Can you tell us a little bit more?
No, they are psychoactive. They'll range anywhere from affecting galantamine, anandamide, GABA. Some of them affect even dopamine and serotonin directly themselves. The thing that really interests us the most, if we look at really the history of plant medicine, almost never was it just this one drug or one target, one compound approach. That's kind of this simplistic approach that it would be great if medicine and the human body worked that way. I can cure you just by affecting this one thing. I mean, no, our all of historical medicine and plant use has always been mixtures of trying to figure out, without understanding really the first principle science, what combinations can most impact. And we now have the ability to use some of that first principle science to better understand, if not have a full knowledge, which we may never have, about why these things work.
And that brings us back to the potions conversation. right? Because obviously from an indigenous or from a historical perspective, potions were always used. We know this with ayahuasca. We even know this with psilocybin and cacao with the ancient Aztecs. We know this with kykeon in ancient Greece. We just talked about the potion that the ancient Zoroastrian priests use as well. So potions are really the ancient historical context that need to be brought into the present moment. And what I'm hearing from you is we've had this sort of shamanic relationship or lineage with a lot of these psychoactive plants, but we haven't necessarily understood the scientific part of it. In the 50s and 60s, these weren't really known of, so to say. So there wasn't like a ton of clinical research done on them, but we now can actually go and do further dives and further research into the efficacy of these and what they might be most useful for. And I assume that these are also unscheduled, just like the Beta-Carboline Syrian Rue is unscheduled. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Unscheduled, and part of our work is to figure out what is the right dosage. And just because it's unscheduled doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe. So also part of what we have to figure out as we go through our deep pharmacological investigation is to make sure that the dosages that we're putting forth, while this may not be regulated by the FDA, does fall within a safe limit.
Shauheen, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just maybe for the audience who are listening, like the way that we are doing our drug discovery is that we have access to these plants, then we extract their alkaloids to very pure alkaloids, and then we recombine them. So it's not a full spectrum, extract. We know exactly what compounds come from, let's say, this plant. Like we have optimized everything around our extraction, and then the recombination is based on the data that we get from so many biomarkers, which are brainwave, heart rate, sleep pattern, and there are so many that kind of like through our drug discovery, we have been developing. So the world of sleep has been like, we have done a lot of work. That's how we came up with START and with MANG, which is for lucid dreaming. Our other formulation, Emertod, which is mostly around this physiological, is around neuroprotection and neurogenesis. This is another effect of harmine, which has been studied for many years to treat like neurodegenerative diseases, like it's a microdose. And then we have another product which is for deep sleep, which is currently called haoma. We're changing the name. And as John said, like we're actually coming up with like kind of like 2 or 3 macro doses that like they're more perceptive, you feel it, and then there are different applications for that. And with those, like this is kind of like you just take it once, and then it's more like a stronger effect that you have to like go through, experience, and then integrate. One thing which is like you brought, Paul, which was very interesting, it was around like taking psychedelics. And then when we were taking psychedelics, we were talking about like this, everything that comes out from our psyche, from our subconscious and unconscious, and then reintegrating that into your life. I'm just like, I've been studying mostly recently, like the work that Jung has done, and it's just like so amazing. Like he has gone beyond the point that most of like people like Freud has gone, just to see like how this whole world of alchemy or archetypes, like of somehow defining or modeling unconscious. So it's fascinating that like usually unconscious is not that easy to be integrated because it's fully unknown, versus the subconscious is like something that you have either seen or in your childhood. It's a trauma that you have at least some indication about, somehow to ingest and process it to your today's life. But again, what is very fascinating about this beta-carbolines is like it opens something to you that maybe you understand about the wider consciousness, about the wider universe, and things that you have never had any information about. And so this is the part that Claudio Naranjo, for your audience, if they are interested to read his book, The Healing Journey, like he has an experiment, like he's a Chilean psychotherapist who came to Berkeley later on, and then he has the psychiatrist who has injected harmaline, basically like I guess he has injected 10-methoxyharmaline into intravenously into his patients, and then the book has a chapter is called Harmaline and Collective Unconscious, that he has reported that 3 of the reports, like it's a very detailed report of 3 of his patients, about what they see and about this instantaneous knowledge that they have gained and seen and realized about themselves. That is very fascinating. It's very different from the use of, let's say, psilocybin, LSD, and other tryptamine effects.
Follow-up question, and I'm glad you brought up Claudio Naranjo. I actually had he passed away, I think, a few years ago. But I had the honor of seeing him talk at an Ibogaine conference in 2016, the first ever psychedelic conference I attended, and he happened to be there talking about Ibogaine because he was one of the early pioneers of Ibogaine for addiction and transpersonal and all these sorts of things. So his book is called The Healing Journey. There's a chapter in there about haoma and the unconscious. Jonathan, anything to add to that about kind of Jungian psychology, subconscious, unconscious, the use of these medicines for that work?
Yeah, being completely out of my field here, the only thing whenever I read about Huxley's concept of the reducing valve and Jung and collective unconscious, even to more of our modern approaches for the concept of things like the cortical colostral network or the default mode network, I always look at these are all just different languages we're using to try and describe the same thing, which is to try and understand this mystery within our own brain. And maybe Andrew Gallimore is right with his alien information theory. I can neither disprove or prove any of these here, but these are all different ways we have of just trying to explain the complexities of our brain that all these psychoactive compounds for 6,000 years, we as humans have, at least 6,000 years, we as humans have been trying to experiment with to try and better understand ourselves.
So let's talk a little bit about both of your experiences with this. I mean, Shauheen, you were born in Iran. You now live in Canada. You're in Vancouver. Just tell us a little bit about when did you first hear about haoma? When did you first start utilizing it yourself? And you also are, I don't know if this is the correct terminology, but you are a whirling dervish, or you practice whirling as part of that. Have you ever combined haoma with a psychedelic and then done a whirling dervish thing? And what was that like, if you have?
No, I haven't mixed the two, and I kind of like.
Would
but
that be
we have
considered
studied them.
sacrilegious, or like not? It's like better to keep them distinct or separate, or have you just not necessarily done it?
Not necessarily. It's just like the whole notion of whirling is more like is it's like an invocation. Like you just have to. It's like prayer too. It's not just a higher state of consciousness that you're experiencing. It's a practice of balance. It is, like it's kind of like putting yourself out, and then your mind also like just taps into another level. That is, John, is very interesting because we have been kind of trying to unlock the brain under whirling, by collecting brain data waves, and we're gonna just have some works published soon around that too. But just to answer your question, no, I haven't mixed. But back to just learning about Homa and like where it comes from, like I had no idea about any of these when I was back in Iran, and like my connection to psychedelics come from the kind of like around 2017 with just doing an ayahuasca ceremony in California, and then from there. I kind of like work mostly on extraction of plants, like working on plant uh, medicines, mostly around alkaloids or what are the alkaloids, chemistry, etc. And then psilocybin was very interesting to me, but I guess just like working around Homa and what was those plant medicine, that Eastern plant medicine, came through basically research and readings that later on, like 2020, 2019, and later on. But my own experience, I have tried different psychoactives, and I think like after a while, as you know, like you kind of like you learn how the subjective experience is, and then you after a while it might just fade off, but at the same time you always have the experience and knowledge of how it was, and then you try to even bring that subjective experience and kind of making it as part of your regular life too. um, yeah, I can say that let's say maybe 2022, I just did psychedelics twice because of our work, and we are doing a lot of things at the same time. But in terms of like these lower doses, so we have been doing a lot of experimentation, specifically back in 2021, which was a very hard year for John and I to work and produce, and at the same time do the embarked on a 21 week of experimentation that we had to just like do everything on a very controlled basis for our experimental design, and and then basically just collecting even data when you are in that subjective effect, is a subjective experience, is not that easy. Like I feel very sick. John is usually like more alert, and he can do writing. I try to lie down, and just be the observer mostly. But I think our combination plus the other people who have participated and tested our product gave us a lot of information for us to be able to come out and bring these products to the market.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I came at it much more from I'm a tried and true engineer, despite that I consider Shauheen to be much more of a chemical engineer than myself. My interest has always been trying to understand and measure to try and quantify what are the different experiences that we have. And when I first got interested in this here, my first business that I had started after leaving corporate America was around early childhood development, as 85% of the brain is developed by the time a toddler is age 3. And so many of these interventions that we try and interfere or try and improve, they come at a much later state. So I spent a lot of time in the world of developmental neuroscience. And when I started to explore psychedelics more, it was really much more from the okay, we all have these common experiences that we often talk about. Is there actually something scientifically we can measure from that? And then from my own personal experience, as the best way to really do any type of measurement is to experiment on yourself. Like what is actually happening to your own brain, body, physiological symbols, at least that we can measure to try and have some type of correlation to understand subjectively, does this match up with what's happening within my brain and body? It was I wasn't a lifelong psychonaut by any means, and I'm not so sure I would even still consider myself a psychonaut now. It really began much more with a scientific curiosity that, as I began to experiment more, I came to manifest and realize like how much trauma I'd just been holding on to and repressing from myself, going back to my childhood, and how much resentment. And I'd say I inadvertently found myself into a therapeutic solution, thanks to my scientific curiosity of just trying to understand and experiment myself.
So for listeners, since we're nearing the end of the episode now, for listeners who are, they've tuned in, the historical context is fascinating. We've talked about the neurobiology of this. We've talked about, some of the other, outside of haoma and Syrian Rue and, the Beta-Carbolines, which is in starred. We've also talked about the Chinese psychoactives that you'll bring to market relatively soon. Just, if listeners are like, hey, this sounds interesting, it sounds like something that I really like to explore with starred, which is one of the main supplements, the one that I talked about, the one that you all have tried. What are some expectations maybe? Like if they're saying, hey, I'd like to try this for a month with a microdose, what should they pay attention to? What are maybe some great things to try out as part of that to explore what this substance can do? Just for listeners at home who are like, I'm considering this and I'd like to look more into it. What should they be aware of?
Use case, I think, or intention, if I were to use a synonym for use case, I think is absolutely critical. And this goes the same with anything, whether you're taking a really mind-blowing psychedelic dose or more of a microdose. In the case of starred, the clear intention is around helping to amplify or deepen a state of deep meditation. So getting into a consistent practice around mindfulness, not only around your just intentions itself, but even setting the schedule of having a constant time of day. So Shauheen and I differ in this, and that I'm one that, for me, I meditate first thing in the morning, 15 minutes every day. And Shauheen is more of a night meditator. And no matter when you do it, it doesn't really matter. But having that as part of this intentional mindfulness time that you've carved out for yourself, that's when you'll get the most benefit out of something like starred, if you are to use it as directed. I mean, if you are to then take a much higher dose than is recommended and combine it with a tryptamine, there's a very different use behind it, which I think your listeners can understand well and probably have a lengthy experience about how to cultivate that intention. But each one of our products, if you were to use, I would say has to be combined together with what is your objective here and what are you trying to get out of it, even if it's something intrinsic of exploration and meditation, or through dreaming with our Mang Lucid Dreaming products.
Yeah, and I would add to that, like if they take start only for meditation and let's say as as we have dose per capsule or per dosage. Usually the effect is it just takes about 1 hour. It start about from 10 minutes and may last for about 30 minutes to about 45 minutes. The effect is, some people, they feel it very strongly. Some people, it's just very slight effect. And this is just with one dose of our start. And then again, if they want to just take it to the next level, maybe they can just take 2 capsules, again, and sit in meditation and see, how it goes. But it's not, I don't recommend you to take it and then and then think that you can work, because that's not like a psilocybin microdosing. It's not going to contribute directly to your productivity. It makes you a little bit numb, which is like the other side. And then if they want to combine it with any type of tryptamines, then again, as John said, we always suggest to go very thoughtfully with intention, and then they can take, let's say, with their right dose, which is the dose that they know and are aware of, they can take between 1 to 3 capsules of our start, and then that is kind of that adds a very perpendicular direction to their subjective experience, which is kind of again, which is like a tryptamine effect, which is just think more, the flush of thoughts are going very fast. And then this direction of unknowns is also added, which is more like an ayahuasca experience.
So have an intention, understand the use case of it, more for meditation than productivity. Maybe start with 1, go up to 2. You could even try it with maybe an LSD microdose versus a psilocybin microdose. And I would say stick to a consistent protocol. So if working with this, instead of just doing it once, really try to deepen that meditative practice by doing it, let's say, for a month, 2 or 3 times a week in combination with a microdose, to see how it helps you to deepen that overall practice of meditation. Now, final question is, listeners are interested, they're curious. Tell us a little bit where they can find out more information. What's the website? We already talked about the name of the product, which is STARD, STARD. But if they want to find out more information, where can they go to check this out?
Head to ancestralmagi.com, ANCESTRAL, Magi, MAGI.com. You can also follow us on our different socials, where we regularly post different content related to either the historical nature, the scientific nature, or even just the personal nature of some of these different medicines. And there on our website, you'll find a wide variety of information, not just around the overall products itself, the usage, some of the historical context, and importantly, the science behind what we've studied to bring some of these to market. And of course, for any listeners of our followers of Third Wave, we have a coupon code in honor of our esteemed host here, Paul 10.
PAUL 10, which will get you 10% off, right?
Right. Yeah, and be on the lookout for some of the new compounds that the new products that we'll be bringing out to market that we're hoping that we can launch within the next month. So.
Oh wow! So this is coming out really soon. So by the time this podcast is out, it'll be on the horizon very soon. So check those out. Shauheen, Jonathan, this has been fun. I'm glad we got to do. I learned a bunch from this interview. It's probably one of those interviews that our listeners might have to listen to 1 or 2 times or 3 times to really get a feel for it and a sense for it. Ancestralmagi.com. Paul 10 is the coupon code. Gentlemen, this has been an honor. Thank you for joining us on the Psychedelic Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Paul. Honor has been all ours.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the third wave of psychedelics, subscribe to this channel and visit thethirdwave.co, where you'll find plenty of free resources on intentional and responsible psychedelic use.